Hello, hello. I'm Yuval. I'm a registered social worker and psychotherapist. And today we'll be talking about mania. We're going to explore mania from many domains and develop a very holistic perspective on the phenomenon. First, let's just be sure that we are on the same page by what we mean by mania. And we'll start this by differentiating hypomania from the manic state. The biggest difference between the two is severity. So, just as sadness is the milder version of full on depression, hypomania is the milder version of a full blown manic episode. I would also argue that hypomania is something that people without bipolar disorder experience from time to time. It is a time of increased energy as well as optimism. Being in hypomania can feel great. You're able to get more things done, and you may find that your thinking is a bit clearer. You're functioning a little bit better than you usually are. I can see this in people who don't have a diagnosis of bipolar disorder when they get that job that they've really been wanting to get, or when someone who they had a crush on for a long time said yes. These events that are positive can create a hypomanic like response. That doesn't mean that hypomania is necessarily bad. In the case of bipolar disorder, though, that is not the case. Every manic episode starts as a hypomania, which is why in bipolar disorder, hypomania is the period of time where the individual experiencing it is aware and can change the trajectory of the state so it doesn't lead to a full blown manic episode. When we cross this line between hypomania and mania, we see a massive reduction in functioning. Now, to the person in mania, they may be functioning more than optimally, but in terms of what it is that they're actually working on, that is not the case. They may be very involved in working on a particular project. However, that project is not going to come into fruition, and they also have likely quit their job or got fired. So, functioning in this case is best determined by the people around the individual who's experiencing hypomania or mania. Another thing that differentiates hypomania and mania is the duration. Hypomania is generally experienced for less than a week, while a manic episode is experienced for more than a week and can at times be months long. And in this video, we will explore the physical, cognitive, emotional, social, environmental, and spiritual domains as they relate to mania. Do keep in mind that all of these domains bleed into each other. So, for example, if you are anxious about something, then your heart rate may go up. On the reverse, if you drink too much coffee and your heart rate is up, you may develop anxious thoughts. So, although we have to separate these domains in order to make sense of things, please don't conceptualize these domains as distinctly separated from one another. Let's start with the physical domain. Someone in mania doesn't need that much sleep, or at least they don't think they do. They can be up for 2 or 3 days and still have more energy than anybody in the room. One way to see mania is an excess of energy that only accumulates until it crashes into a depression. Someone in mania will also have a faster metabolism. So the longer that an episode goes on for, the more weight they can potentially lose. In the same vein, their heart rate as well as their blood pressure will increase. They will also have dilated pupils. And when you add all of these symptoms up, it very much mimics someone who's abusing meth, crack, or cocaine. And it is sometimes the case that somebody in mania will be accused of using these drugs when they're actually not. And when it is found out that they're actually sober, that can be even more scary and lead to a lot more questions about what is going on with them. Another thing that happens is the person's senses will actually be heightened. So, people who are in a manic episode can differentiate colors better than when they're at their baseline. Sounds are also heightened. They could hear things that they weren't used to hearing. And they're also very sensitive to temperature. So they're likely to sweat a lot more than usual while they're in this state. And that, of course, doesn't help with the false accusations of somebody in a manic episode actually just being on meth. Now let's look at cognition. In mania, people have racing thoughts, but it is not the same as if you're excited about something and your thoughts are racing up because you're excited. It's more along the lines of actually taking meth, and that's changing how quickly you are thinking. It is not something that's comparable to sober, mentally sound life. The other thing that we see within a manic episode is hyperdivergent thinking. Divergent thinking is when you're able to make a connection between two concepts that other people wouldn't generally make. It is the foundation of creativity to link two concepts together that most people have never thought of. In mania, divergent thinking escalates into hyperdivergent thinking, and this is often what we see in psychosis. And to a lot of people, this can be mistaken for schizophrenia, which makes sense. There is a bit of overlap during mania. For example, let's say you're at a kebab place and you're manic, and somebody orders a dish that your mother ordered. Therefore, that customer knows your mother. It is odd thinking like this that we see in mania. We also see a drop in what we call the significance threshold. At any given moment, you are being sent sensory inputs, whether it's visual, auditory, or otherwise. We have evolved a mechanism to make sure that not everything is equally as significant. We call this the significance threshold. So, what is above the threshold is significant, what is below it is noise, background noise. Imagine that you are walking with your friends down a busy street. You're having a conversation, and although auditorially you can hear both his voice and the people around it, the significance threshold ensures that you are only focusing on his voice. Otherwise, you could get lost with the stream of voices of people walking down the street. In mania, that threshold drops significantly to the point where what somebody behind you said is equally as important as to the conversation you were having with your friend. And when this is mixed up with hyperdivergent thinking, we get the psychotic narrative that evolves through the manic episode. But we will touch upon that very shortly. In a manic state, the individual also loses awareness. So they no longer think that their state is unusual from their average state. They also lose awareness in how they are thinking. So they lose some metacognition and they lose the ability to predict consequences for their actions. So somebody may steal something from a store, but it's okay because the cashier gave him a look that told him everything's going to be okay, it's all good. And so, as the psychoticism rises, they will start to lose the basic understanding of cause and effect when it comes to interacting with the world. Also, they tend to be quite grandiose. This is often due to the psychotic narrative, but can also be due to them feeling that due to these racing thoughts, this hyperdivergent thinking, and the inability to sense what is significant, they think they just discovered the secrets of the universe. And only they know it. Maybe some other people that they're trying to find. But this makes them very special. And because of that, they tend to be quite grandiose. Now let's talk about how mania affects the emotional realm. In mania, we see very low cognitive empathy, and this is the type of empathy that requires a frame of mind. So I can understand where you're coming from. I have an idea about how you make decisions, and therefore I can empathize with your individual experience. This sense is very, very weak in mania. And my prediction as to why that is because their own theory of mind for themselves is very low at that state, meaning they are more disconnected from viewing their thoughts while being distanced from it. So that's the metacognition. And if you can't have a theory of mind for yourself, how can you have it for other people? So, because of that, they may not understand why people are feeling the way that they are. However, people in mania have very high affective empathy. And this is the empathy that you catch while hearing a beautiful song or when your friend is telling you a very emotional story. It's not a type of empathy that you need to think about, but it's an empathy that you feel. And in mania, the affective empathy is through the roof. So if you're in mania, you can feel what other people are feeling to some extent, but not understand why. And this can be a very confusing experience. I remember when I was in my manic episodes, I would cry for my friends because I could feel what they were feeling, and I was able to feel it to such a intense degree that I felt like I was just letting it out for them. but at the same time, I was not exactly sure why they were feeling that way. I have a snapshot understanding, but I cannot see the big picture behind why that emotion is relevant. And as you can imagine, this will leave people in mania within emotional extremes and chaos. Another thing that happens is that as the hypomania escalates into a mania, the intensity of emotions become narrower towards the more severe side. I think it's best to show this through a graph. Over here, we have five different types of emotions and three different intensities of the feelings. So, someone who's happy can either feel pleasant, they can feel good, or they can feel overjoyed, but all are within the category of happy. As mania progresses, we lose the ability to feel the lower intensity of emotions. So now we can no longer feel the pleasantness. It's either good or overjoyed for happiness. And by the time we're in a manic episode, we can no longer feel the moderate intensity of an emotion. And so, no matter what we are feeling, whether it's happy, sad, angry, or afraid, we are experiencing the most intense version of that emotion. Ashamed isn't an emotion that is strongly felt by people in mania. They're quite shameless. And it's funny that this has been noted in the literature because it's something I've seen with my clients. They will brag about things they did while manic because of how uncharacteristically shameless they were. So, on the topic of shame, let's talk about the social domain. People in mania are hyper extroverted. They want to talk to as many people as they can because it's stimulating. And if there is one thing a person in mania likes is stimulation. They will tend to talk a lot more to the point where other people cannot get a sentence in. They will also have pressured speech. So it's as if every word of the sentence is emphasized. Maybe not to this degree, but it certainly feels that there's a lot of intensity behind every word that they are saying. Another thing we see is a breakdown in communication due to two reasons. The first is racing thoughts, and the second is due to the effects of psychosis. So let's start with the psychosis one. Let's say I was in a manic episode and you were a friend that was witnessing me, and we were talking about something, and then a mutual friend of ours, Evan, comes in, and I will speak to him as if he has all of the information that we relayed between us, even though he just came into the picture. This is due to the psychotic feature where boundaries no longer exist. So when I was telling you something, I was telling humanity as a whole. And since our friend here is part of humanity as a whole, he would have received the message and understood it just as much as I'm sure you did. The second reason why we see communication breakdown is due to racing thoughts. And you can picture this as so many thoughts trying to get through and out of someone's mouth that their order starts to become jumbled. And what we see are people who are trying to make a point, but it's become a little gibberish like, and often that can lead to misunderstandings by what they meant. When Kanye West said, or Ye now, when he said slavery is a choice, I saw that same communication breakdown happen during that interview. The breakdown could be understood as follows. Let's say I'm manic and I'm trying to get 3 points across to you, and each of these points has two sentences. I will start by making point one's first sentence. However, because my thoughts are a little bit quick, I won't say the second sentence, and I'll say the first sentence of the second point. And then I may move on to the second sentence of the third point, not saying the first, and then going back to the first point and saying the second sentence. It's as if the content is there, but due to the speed of thoughts, it cannot be ordered properly. The individual is too stimulated and cannot communicate effectively. Also, keep in mind that talking to people will further stimulate the manic person so that their communication will be even more poor. And this is one of the many vicious cycles that perpetuate the manic state. A cool but horrifying part of mania is that the manic individual cannot properly register the facial expressions of those around him. So he can be in a room filled with people who are frowning or angry with him, and because he feels that things are going well, he thinks everyone else is feeling the same thing, even though everyone wants him to get out. This can lead to a lot of issues, as you could imagine, where people in mania are simply not able to be there for the people in their lives who need them for emotional support or anything of the sort. Another aspect to mania is hypersexuality. Because of the unrealness of the manic state, because it feels like a magical dream that you can do anything you want without consequences, as we mentioned before. Some people in mania will cheat on their partners. This is so tragic for both sides because the individual who got cheated on obviously got cheated on, and their partner is clearly unwell, and the solution or treatment may not be obvious. It's also tragic for the individual who cheated because that did not feel real. It didn't feel like themselves. Mania often feels like possession, which we'll talk about later. And naturally, there was a moral injury at play. And so, something we woke on when we're integrating the manic episode is the factor of cheating and moral injuries that were sustained while in that episode. The behavioral activation system in someone who's manic is working on overdrive. Essentially, they are looking for opportunities. The behavioral inhibition system, which says, hey, let's see the dangers of this opportunity, isn't there. So they are likely to engage in a lot more than they would otherwise, while also not seeing the risks, leading to increased risk taking behavior. We also see paranoia happen usually towards the middle end of a manic episode. And this is usually due to the psychotic narrative that has been building over time. We will also see false accusations of many differing and quite creative claims. Because of the hyperdivergent thinking and the significant threshold drop, the person in mania can create some very elaborate narratives about what's going on with the people in their lives. And so paranoia does have a place in the manic episode. On the environmental front, I must say it really changes between hypomania and mania. When someone is hypomanic, their houses are so clean because they have all this energy without the distracting psychotic narrative to channel it. So it is very common for them to channel it into cleaning, into taking care of themselves, into going to the gym. In mania, it's the opposite. So people in that state are likely to have bad hygiene and bad eating habits, as well as their homes are a mess. And often we do see hypographia, which is where somebody compulsively is writing down things. I believe this is due to the drop of the significance threshold and people wanting to remember something that seemed so meaningful at the time, but then when the manic episode ends, they have no idea what they were talking about. And part of this is because memories are stored within emotional and physiological states. So it is very difficult for someone who was in mania to recall what they did. They can remember a good amount of things, but usually people have to help them fill in the gaps of what they did, what they said, because the manic state is a very extreme emotional and physiological state. It's unlikely that the person can go to that state to retrieve the memories that were created during mania. The hypographia will be seen in notebooks, random pieces of paper, and sometimes on the walls. So it has that caricature schizophrenic look of all of these words on the walls, sometimes connected by strings, and hopefully the damage isn't too bad. They also spend a lot of their money, much more so than would be responsible or typical for them. The reason is that they don't have the usual sense of cause and effect within the social life. So they may think that, yes, they are spending half of their savings right now, but they had a good hunch that the universe will pay them back and then some. So they are not in the best position for financial responsibility. Let's talk about the spiritual aspects of mania because, as horrible and as destructive the state is, it can be one of the most spiritually important experiences of someone's life. The psychotic narrative is one that they acquire over time in mania that makes them the most important person on earth. So they can have a serious connection with something that they may feel is above them, within them, timeless. There is a lot of spiritual experiences within a single manic episode, and this can simply be overwhelming. The most common psychotic narrative I've experienced and have seen within my clients is the Messiah complex. People believe that they are the second coming of Christ. They have something that will redeem the world, save it, and move it into some type of utopia. Something that makes these complexes, narratives, much more difficult is the hallucinations someone in mania can have. And this is where schizophrenia and bipolar actually divert. The bipolar hallucinations are essentially cheerleaders or mentors designed for the psychotic narrative, and they're often held in very, very high regard. Most of my clients have had great relationships with their hallucinations, and grieving them once the episode is over is actually part of the recovery process. Before we go, I want to give you two metaphors for mania. The first is my understanding of what is actually going on. And this has not been researched, but I'm looking forward to the day when it has. I believe that what happens between hypomania and mania is a subclinical focal seizure that overstimulates the sympathetic nervous system. Everything we discussed can be seen as the downstream effects of this potential seizure. And because it's subclinical, it could start long before the manic episode. Additionally, I would argue that the seizure intensifies until eventually the whole sympathetic nervous system breaks down. And we see this. We see the body breaking down near the end of long manic episodes. So somebody may lose a lot of muscle mass. They may have a general weakness. Their brains may be on fire with manic energy, but they're struggling to stand up. And I think that when the sympathetic nervous system crashes, that's when we see the bipolar depression, where the behavioral activation system, which is very, very closely tied with the sympathetic nervous system, is simply not being able to be used voluntarily, meaning that it's harder for a depressed person to engage in anything. So that is the sympathetic nervous system seizure hypothesis, and I hope it will catch like fire so someone can study it. The other way of seeing a manic episode is a false positive for the emergency strength activation. Let me put this into simple terms. There are many cases documented where, let's say, a car has an accident and is on someone's child. The mother will get superhuman strength and lift the car. And over time, the adrenaline which pumped her up will dissipate and she'll start to feel the muscle aches for that amazing feat. And now imagine if this situation was reversed. There was no car accidents, but someone over time got the adrenaline response as if there was a crisis. Just as if you drink too much coffee, you're going to feel anxious, When you're pumped with this much adrenaline, you're going to think there is a crisis going on that you have to address. Where in the example, the crisis was the the car over the child. In manic psychosis, the crisis is redeeming the world. So we could think of that scenario reversed with no actual crises. So overall, mania affects all domains of a person. You can't separate the influence on emotion from the influence on the physical. They are all deeply interconnected. Because of that, mania can feel like a possession. It has possessed every domain of your being and changed it into a very particular archetype. It is understandable why people in ancient times viewed mania as a possession. I think it's also interesting to note that people who had epileptic seizures were seen as experiencing a possession. If mania was proven to be a sympathetic nervous system seizure, I think that would be quite poetic. It can certainly feel like someone else occupied your body and you did things that you are very, very shameful for post mania. And that is why it is so important to integrate what happened with your general narrative of who you are, what was your past, and where are you going. This is something I offer my clients, and it is personally my favorite part of the job. I get to watch them forgive themselves and have conversations with people around them that they were too ashamed of having, and watching those conversations be so fruitful and wholesome. And if this is something that you think you need, I do offer 20-minute free consultations. So I will leave the link in the description. I really hope this has been helpful. Bye for now.